too cold. A few years ago, I bought a parasite-resistant ram from a lady that had a flock of parasite-resistant sheep, and I gave her a deposit and put the money down, I think in February, and then I went to go pick the sheep up, or the baby ram, in May. And it was a different breed of parasite-resistant sheep. It wasn't St. Croix, but I was hoping to improve my herd with this genetics of this ram. And I looked at her other sheep, and they looked great. This ram was registered. It was about 5 months old. It had all of its papers. It looked totally healthy. And as it grew up, I could tell that it had muscled out more than the St. Croix. It was bigger and thicker. It had more meat on it. It was putting on weight really quick. And so I was hoping to improve the genetics of my flock with this new ram. And then by the time it was about 7 months old, one day it just fell over dead. And I looked at it, and its gums were white, and its eyeball was totally white. It had been sucked dry by worms. It had really no parasite resistance. And so I remember asking the lady that sold me the ram, how many times do you worm your sheep? And every time I asked her that question, she went off on something about how they're all parasite resistant or whatever, but she would never tell me exactly how many times a year she worms her own sheep. And since I'd already paid her a deposit and I'd driven like about 5 hours to get to her farm, another 5 hours back home, I just took the baby ram and went home with it. I didn't think anything bad would happen. And from this experience, now I know to never buy any type of sheep from a farm where they actually use dewormers. Because if they're using dewormers, and it could be St. Croix, it could be Katahdin, it could be anything. If they're using dewormers, then you're going to have to use dewormers too on any animal you buy from that flock. And here's why. I'm up to about 100 head of St. Croix sheep, and I lost 2 already to parasites, but the other 98 are just fine. So even though I've been culling for parasites for 16 years now, there's still some that mutate and become not resistant to parasites anymore. They just can't handle the parasites. So when I cull my herd for these ones that are not parasite resistant, or I just let them die on their own, or just don't do anything because I don't use dewormers, then my herd goes back to being 100% parasite resistant every year. So while there may be these mutations that mutate downward and lose their parasite resistance, because I never use dewormers, then I'm not going to be breeding any more non-parasite resistant sheep. Now, if I didn't cull my sheep herd, and I let these 2%, these 2 additional sheep live in my herd, and I dewormed them and I kept them alive, then the next year I'm going to have even more sheep that have a problem of being non-parasite resistant. And every year that I keep deworming my sheep and letting these sheep reproduce and produce offspring inside my flock, at some point I'm going to have a large percentage of my sheep that are no longer parasite resistant and depend on chemicals to live. And that's happened to every sheep breed, and it can happen to the St. Croix just as well if you start using dewormers. I had a fellow from Oklahoma call me the other day and tell me that when he first started his St. Croix flock, he didn't deworm them, and he lost 20% of his flock because the people before him apparently were doing something with worms or dewormers or whatever. And so I started realizing how blessed I was to have a flock. When I started my flock, I got it from a lady who had never dewormed her sheep. And so right out of the gate, I never lost hardly any sheep to parasites. These sheep dewormers were all invented in the 1950s. So prior to 1950, every sheep was chemical-free of dewormers. Yet now they all depend on these dewormers to live. I mean, they can't make it without it. It's like they got the entire sheep industry hooked on drugs or something, or on chemicals. And as always, it all comes down to money. Big pharma, big agriculture, big food. They all kind of work together to put these chemicals in there. And once they get them in there and you depend on them, then you're always going to have to pay them money. And so sheep, just like any other animal, they need to be raised in a somewhat hostile environment that culls out the weak and lets the strong survive. And that's how they get improvement in the breed. Another way that sheep become dependent on chemicals is when they're taken to a place that's not their natural environment. A good example would be the Dorper sheep, which is a magnificent animal, very well developed, it grows fast, but it was raised in an area where there were no parasites. It was raised in the desert of South Africa. And prior to 1950, the Dorper sheep existed very well without the help of any of these chemicals. And so if the Dorper did lose, 2% of the flock every year due to parasites or some other problem, they just lost it. And what was left over became totally parasite resistant for that area, for the desert. So every year it might have lost a few, but it became more resilient. When they brought these Dorper sheep to the United States, like let's say the desert of Utah, it was slightly different, but now instead of being like 98% parasite resistant, it might have only been 90% parasite resistant. Well, anybody that pays to bring a sheep like that all the way to the United States is going to deworm them. Had they never dewormed the Dorper and been willing to lose this 10% of sheep, then they could have acclimatized the Dorper to Utah and could have gradually gotten it where it could survive there. If they were willing to accept losses, the Dorper could have been parasite resistant in Utah. But they fixed the problem with chemical dewormers. But then if you were to take the Dorper to a place with a lot of parasites like Tennessee, you might find that 90% of them are no longer parasite resistant. And maybe 10% are. Well, no one is going to take their flock and just quit deworming them to find out which ones are going to survive. It is all about maximizing profit, and so they're not going to cull anything. And so the Dorper will always be chemically dependent in the southeast United States. And this is true with almost every sheep breed, not just the Dorper. But any sheep breed that's using these chemicals, once they start, they can't get back off of it. And it's not just chemical dewormers, it's also things like antibiotics and a whole range of different kinds of medicines they're having to use on sheep to control everything from foot rot to just making sure they're healthy. And years ago, they didn't have that. They culled the sick ones. So now all these sick genetics are inside each of these sheep herds, and they depend on these different types of medications just to survive to the next day. And while these medications are not approved for humans, yet when they put them on the sheep, you are ultimately absorbing these medications yourself. So don't think they don't apply to you. They do. And this is what you see in the grocery store. Sheep that have been raised on chemicals and can never get off of it. That's why I raise pure natural sheep. They're pure because they've never had any chemicals given to them. They're raised naturally in a natural environment. And the only thing I have to do is have a dog and have fence and have enough hay for the winter to make it through. But I also know that when I sit down to eat supper at night, I don't have these chemicals on my plate, that I'm eating organic lamb. And I want to tell you right now, you cannot grow organic lamb if you're using dewormers. Because if you look at the USDA's national list of allowed and prohibited substances, and you look at what synthetic substances are allowed or prohibited for organic certification for sheep, then these dewormers, which are called parasiticides, they are strictly prohibited in any type of slaughter stock, any type of meat that you produce off your farm. They cannot be dewormed and still get their organic certification. And even the ewes cannot have dewormers during the last third of their pregnancy. And they can't be used, dewormers cannot be used while the ewes are lactating. So while before the lambs are weaned, you can't even take care of the ewes. So that ought to tell you something about how healthy these dewormers are. If you can't get your organic certification because they're no longer organic, there's something wrong with the food, then why would you want to use dewormers in the first place? So when I sit down to eat, I'm eating something that's healthy. And to be honest, that's worth more than money. I know people tell you how much money you can make off selling sheep or whatever, and you could make money, I suppose, off organic sheep. But if you ever lose your health, then you'll do anything to get it back. And your health is worth so much more than money. And so I no longer buy my food or my meat down at the grocery store because I know what's been done to that meat. But yet the food I grow, I know exactly what's been done. And I'm making these videos to encourage people to take control of their own food supply because we've got a real problem out there. So anyway, thank you so much for watching the video. Bye.